Yes, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session entitled Russia's War in Ukraine, Arctic Impacts, organized by the UiT, Arctic University of Norway, and the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI. My name is Bjarge Schwenke Foss. I'm a researcher in border studies at the Center for Geopolitics, Peace and Security at UiT, and I will be chairing this session. It's now been almost 4 years since Russia launched its full-scale war against Ukraine, an event that had profound impacts on Russia, economically, politically, socially. However, the effects of this war extend far beyond Russia and Ukraine. They've been felt across the globe. In this session, we'll have a closer look at the impact of the war on our region, so to speak, the Arctic. So over the next hour and a half, we will examine how Russia is implementing its policies across various Arctic domains and what it means for us. We're honored to have 4 speakers with us today, plus one. I'll return to him. Please allow me to introduce them. It's from the right here, Thomas Nilsen, who is the editor of Barents Observer, which is an independent, bilingual English-Russian news site based on the very border between Norway and Russia in Kirkenes. The Barents Observer covers the European Arctic and northern Russia. Thomas himself has extensive knowledge on both Russia and the Arctic. His primary journalistic focus is on environmental issues, security, and let's not forget combating disinformation. And then we have Kari Aga Myklebost, who is a professor in Russian history at UiT. She's an expert on modern Russian history and also Russian-Norwegian relations, with a particular focus on the northern areas. In recent years, Kari has been publishing extensively on Russian memory politics and hybrid activities in the Norwegian Arctic. And then we have Mark Lantain, who is also a professor at UiT in political science. He's also an adjunct lecturer at the University of Greenland, which is, of course, interesting these days. He specializes in China, Asia Pacific, Oceania, and polar regions security studies. And some of his current research explores Beijing's domestic and international politics, emphasizing China's growing role in the Arctic. And then we have Elana Wilson-Rove, professor of global governance at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. And she's also a research professor and head of the Center for Ocean Governance at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI. Elana's core research areas include, of course, governance, as I mentioned, but also diplomacy, which we'll touch upon soon, international relations, geopolitics, security politics. Elana is a recognized expert on Russia in the Arctic. So that's the 4 speakers, and I'll return to them soon. But before we hear more from them, I would like to introduce a 5th person who is sitting next to me here. It's Urmas Paet. We are very happy to have him with us this morning. Urmas Paet has been a member of the European Parliament since 2014, specializing in foreign and security policy issues. He is the vice chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, as well as a member of several other committees. He is the rapporteur for several key reports, including the European Defence Union report and the EU Arctic Policy report. He is the European Parliament's standing rapporteur for the Arctic region. In 2019, he founded the Arctic Friendship Group and serves as the chair of the group. Prior to joining the European Parliament, Urmas served as the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Estonia for almost 10 years. And he has also served as Minister of Culture and worked as a journalist. So he's quite a capacity in many ways. Urmas will begin this session by providing some overarching comments on the consequences of Russia's warfare in Ukraine for the Arctic from his perspective in the Baltics and the EU. So, tere tulemast, Urmas Paet, the floor is yours.
Oh, finally I understand what you said.
Please.
Oh, so.
Yep.
May I do it standing?
You may do it standing.
Well, do I need the micro?
I think you may need it.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It works. Well, thank you very much for your introduction. And well, as it is, as we see, one of the most popular events during this conference, so that I guess that there should also be bigger rooms, you know. People are on the street queuing to get in, as it looks like. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting. And well, unfortunately, the issue we are discussing today is not that happy, but well, let's try. Of course, the story didn't start 2022. There was very clear background, so that when I started my work in the European Parliament and already before as minister in Estonia, for me personally, it was already at that time quite clear that unfortunately we will see also clear geopolitical changes also in Arctic region. Although 10 plus years ago there were not so many people who agreed with me, I remember I participated also here in Tromsø at the conference around 10 years ago, and then I spoke about security challenges of Arctic, and I got quite a also response from the audience. Lots of people didn't agree with me and had the position that Arctic was, is, and will be always calm and peaceful area, and really nothing happens. But the signs were there already 10 plus years ago. If you recall, then Russia already at that time invested quite heavily into their military capability in Arctic region. And of course, the question was already at that time, why? If you declare that there will be always peace and quiet and nothing happens, why to invest huge money into Arctic military capabilities? But already at that time, Russians did it. We also may recall when they put Russian flag on the bottom of the sea on the North Pole and some other very symbolic elements which were there already that time. And parallelly, of course, all the climate change, the new shipping routes, better access to the raw materials in Arctic already happened at that time. So that in this sense, we need to see many parallel events, be it the physical ones, be it well, state-led events, but the things already happened at that time. And the war, a Russian war against Ukraine, well, unfortunately, didn't start 22, but it already started 2014, so that we have already almost 12 years of war in Ukraine. And 2014, West didn't still take it seriously enough, because if you recall, for instance, the huge gas pipeline between Russia and Germany, Nord Stream 2, the second version, was even built after Russians started war against Ukraine in 2014. So that it was not still the eye-opener for Western countries, including, I would say, also for Arctic region. So that it took another few years when 2022 in February, Russians once again invaded Ukraine with massive force. And only then I would say that the direct developments started to happen. Two Arctic nations, Finland and Sweden, decades and decades declared that, well, there is no need to join NATO, they don't want to do it, public opinion was against. And after February 22, it took few weeks, and the public opinion in Finland and Sweden changed tremendously. And as we all know, now all Nordic countries, including these two, are members of NATO. So that the security space in the northern part of Europe, in the European Arctic, is now, in this sense, united, that all countries in this region are NATO members. But the complete truth is also not that Russia started war against Ukraine. Unfortunately, we also see that Russia started hybrid war against all Europe. And in this sense also, this part of Europe has been involved. First time in history, the Russian-Finnish border is fully closed already for 2 years, because Russians used pure, immigrants as the tool in their hybrid war against Finland, as they did against Poland and Lithuania and Latvia more south. We have seen events on the Baltic Sea where strategic communications, connections were compromised, were cut between Estonia and Finland, also with Sweden, by so-called Shadow Fleet and other ships. So that this is another element which clearly shows that different type of elements of hybrid war are there, also close to this region. We have seen closing of major European airports, including, NATO and European Union capital Brussels and its airport, because of Russian drones flying around, and so on and so on. Mysterious killings, fires, and all other nasty events on the Polish railways, for instance, and so on. So that, and I guess also here in this region, we have seen during the last few years events close to Norwegian border up north, where they also, tested the possibilities to use immigrants as a hybrid warfare tool also against Norway. So that, of course, the overall geopolitical situation, security situation, changed tremendously when Russia directly invaded Ukraine and started hybrid war against Europe as such. Arctic Council. Politically, this organization is paralyzed because there is consensus, a demand in the organization, and of course Russia's participation has been frozen now for a few years. So it means that on some technical level things still are happening, but on basics, on the basic political level, the work has been stopped. So that it's also crucial now to find international and political solution how to deal with Arctic issues, because we all know that the pressure against international law, also international maritime law, which all are very important for Arctic, are tremendously increasing. What we have also seen, unfortunately, because of the changed policies of the United States, that Arctic is not on the hotspot of international affairs only because of Russian war against Ukraine, but also because of policy change in Washington, in the United States. European Union and US found themselves a few weeks ago on the edge of very serious crisis when US President expressed quite directly that there are even plans to invade Greenland, and all those insulting statements against EU member state Denmark and then Greenland, so that it increases even the turbulence in the area of Arctic, including European Arctic. So that the level of confidence, level of trust clearly, unfortunately, has been decreased between Europe and United States, and of course it also has impact to Arctic region. But there are still even more vulnerabilities if we look geopolitically and if you look at the map. We have here nearby Spitsbergen, half of it, if I put this under Russian control, so that of course this is also the area, I guess Europe and we all, including NATO, has to have more clear attention. We have also Iceland with no army. We have still ongoing tensions around Greenland. They didn't disappear. So that I would say that for the future and near future, we still see that the tensions and fragile situation is going to continue. And now, of course, there is question what Europe, what we all should do about it. Of course, I would say that when we saw so rapid change of public opinion in Finland and Sweden about joining to NATO, I would say that it's always better to have two security nets than one. So that for me, the European Union today, and especially already for the upcoming and near future, is also a security organization. That's why I would be, in this sense, very happy, not just emotionally, but I would say also politically and from security point of view, if 3 Nordic countries, Greenland, Norway, and Iceland, will seriously consider why not, under given circumstances and change situation, also once again to think about joining with the European community, with the European Union. Because one is that, yes, you may have very close and well-functioning agreements, but the fact is that you are out. You are not in if something serious really happens. So that comparing to previous times, for the European Union, there is also clear security dimension these days and for the future. If I look at the draft of new European Union budget, new financial framework, which should start from 2027, then first time in history, there is very serious budget line for developing European defense and security. We all know that there are different elements in this, what also EU should do to increase European capabilities, to increase the level of European defense, because unfortunately last 30 years most of European countries didn't invest enough for European defense, but now I would say this is over. I guess that all in Europe today realize that the less we have dependencies from third countries, the better it is. Because I guess the recent also geopolitical developments showed it clearly that we should do much more ourselves in Europe, and the more united we are, the better it is. Of course, there is certain alternative, and this is so-called coalition of willing, which was established last year, that the countries from the European Union, but also European countries which are not in the EU, like UK and Norway and some others, joined under the slogan of coalition of willing. Of course, it was meant mainly about supporting Ukraine and also pressing Russia. But of course, there is perspective that this cooperation can be enlarged, because also in the EU, as we all know very well, there are countries who work against the majority when we speak about security and defense. And there is need for consensus in every and each foreign policy and defense policy decision in the EU, and it's very difficult to reach because of some countries like Hungary, like Slovakia, time to time few others. And that's why there is clear also perspective for so-called coalition of willing. Secondly, Europe clearly has to increase its permanent military presence in Arctic. In Greenland, we saw with the military exercises which now are happening because Denmark finally decided to do so. But looking at all those tensions, all those geopolitical changes, it's clear that Europe has to be present much more. Also, when we speak about the same financial perspective, there is urgent need for new investments also into energy and energy connections in Arctic. We used to say that Europe was very dependent on Russian gas. I would say today the dependency is from the United States when we speak about LNG, but the most secure energy is energy which is produced in Europe. And here, of course, also European Arctic has much bigger possibilities than we have had so far, be it also, for instance, Norwegian gas and oil, but also renewables, wind, water in different Nordic countries, but it needs also adequate connectivity and adequate connections which are not there yet. So, unfortunately, I had only 6 or 7 minutes, but to sum up, then my feeling is that that well, geopolitical situation also here in Arctic already changed tremendously, and the more changes to come, because once again, about climate, more accessibility, it increases the appetite of countries to be here. We know that China in its foreign policy documents calls themselves like near Arctic country. And of course, there are more and more projects Russia and China doing together. I have my doubts that it is only about preserving Arctic nature and environmental stability. I guess that there are some other intentions as well. We see globally harsh attack against international law, including against international maritime law, and this is very important for Arctic to also keep here the stability, but I'm sorry, but we cannot manage it, I guess, without real fight. I mentioned also energy. It will be more and more crucial also for Arctic areas, because, well, Europe, I guess, also changed its mind comparing where we were 10 years ago when Norway saw harsh criticism from the European Union because of ongoing exploration works on oil and gas. I would say it's changed now because, well, the new realities hit in. And finally, once again, I would really like to see that in today's world, Europe seeks more friends, be it in Latin America, be it in India, be it in third countries, but at the same time, we have to be much more united also from inside. And I will not repeat what I very subjectively mean under this, so that if I look at European enlargement, we put lots of energy to Southern Europe, Balkans, Eastern Europe, but we have three beautiful countries which are basically anyway there and ready, if you look from all this rule of law and other very important issues. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess there will be time towards the end to ask some, if anyone would like to ask some questions to Urmas, as well as the other speakers. So, let's turn to the next speaker, Elana. I will start with you as an expert on Russia's Arctic diplomacy. What have been the main trends in Russia's diplomacy in the Arctic region, and how have they changed since the full-scale invasion?
Thank you, Bjarke, and hello, everyone. It's great to be back here at Arctic Frontiers. I was actually trying to remember, I think one of the first times we were here was when NUPI was invited to organize a roundtable on security politics in the region. I remember being younger and more optimistic. I can't remember if it was 10 or 12 years ago. So thinking, and I think it's helpful to do these sort of long lines reflections. I think we tend to kind of otherwise draw a picture of Arctic security and kind of foreign policy politics with sort of a very distinct before and after. And of course we disagree, should the before and after have been 2014 or 2022, but there's certainly a sea change. But at the same time, if you look back at the practical developments in the period, you could look at a country, for example, like Norway, that has increased its defense spending extensively, particularly organized towards Arctic security threats, while also seeking to coordinate and pursue Arctic cooperation where it seemed politically feasible. A tricky balancing act, for sure, as any cooperation, of course, can indicate some sort of return to normal or backing down when it comes to responding to Russia's war against Ukraine. But I think in those long lines, what we see is that there is this, was cooperation against the backdrop of pretty significant security tensions. And of course, the situation we're in today is very, very heightened. And the security, I think rightly so, analytically, politically, is very much in the driver's seat. But I'll comment a little later on where I think kind of coordination still has some gains for Arctic security and stability. So, but kind of looking at Russia's change over time, I think, since we have one historian in the panel, I always feel inspired to look back a little bit. But, an early focus with Russia joining the Arctic Council was very interested in legally binding agreements, very, very much a recipient kind of Arctic aid. Some of you may remember, working on contaminants in the Russian Arctic, food deliveries to Chukotka, and so on. Of course, all that began to change. You have 2007, which we often see as a bit of a pivot with Putin's speech at the Munich Security Council, sort of indicating that Russia was back and not looking to make friends with everyone. You saw the wrapping up of some more involved projects within Russia, like the Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation that I know Thomas knows very well. And then finally, even after the annexation of Crimea, you see that there's sort of an attempt to buffer Arctic politics from these other really, when we look back, I mean, particularly in hindsight, obviously deeply important shifts in the European security environment. I think we should think of it as a narrative of exceptionalism, because I also think this is the period, wasn't as if cooperation was blinding Arctic countries, or at least not all Arctic countries, to the fact that there were growing security threats. And then 2022 with the full-scale invasion and continuation of, as you put it, basically kind of almost a decade of war against Ukraine already, really was a huge shift in Russia's Arctic diplomacy in one way, but also very much in how other Arctic states were finally responding in the diplomatic sphere. So Russia at the time had the Arctic Council chairship, which you could say, it's difficult to say if they hadn't had the chairship what would have happened, but basically the other 7 Arctic states paused their cooperation with Russia, and Russia kind of continued its own chairship internal to the country. With own website, own activities. I think the website's down now. I was trying to go back and check it out. But essentially what you saw there was this kind of some strategies or changes. You saw there was the cultivation of other partners, of course, Russia and China, that Mark is going to talk more about, but also, the Gulf states, the occasional Western academic on a private trip or similar, as well as new agreements like the Coast Guard agreement with China. And often these were framed as saying, well, from kind of at the official level, saying, well, who else would we cooperate with when Arctic states no longer wish to cooperate with us? In media more generally, and there have been some really great studies done both kind of by Norwegian research milieus and also in Canada of the media and policy shifts. What we see after kind of a lag in 2022 is generally a much more negative policy and media rhetoric around other Arctic states that had previously, will not be entirely rosily presented, had a more neutral or positive framing in these media environments. Interestingly enough, in very few of these policy and media accounts is the war against Ukraine ever mentioned. It simply is, for some reason, all these Arctic states stopped cooperating with us, and we don't know why, why'd they do that? So it's sort of a very different media and information sphere in Russia around Arctic issues today. Bilaterally, we see that, kind of Barents and Bering, there's certainly a continuation of some of the agreements, particularly those rooted in international law, but in a very pared back fashion with less of the kind of extra. And I'll get back to that kind of, hopefully in a later question, about sort of how do we proceed with this sort of low-fat version of Arctic cooperation or not. So that's kind of Russia's changing diplomacy in the long lines. I do remember also doing an interview with one Russian official back in, I guess it was 2007, 8, or 9, and they really, at that time, the pursuit of a positive image in the Arctic was very much part of their diplomatic strategy. And I remember asking, what's your, how do you pursue this strategy? And he's like, well, this interview with you, for example. So it's really very much, it's important to look back and think of how some of the analysis, the kind of research environment was also colored by this narrative of exceptionalism. Well, at the same time, I think when we go back and look at actual political change since 2014, we need to have a more nuanced understanding of how building up Arctic security capacities as needed in the Arctic has also been compatible with some continuation of coordination that's been in the interest of other Arctic states for maintaining Arctic security and stability. Well, absolutely, I agree with your point about the importance of also looking at new constellations of actors and new settings for pursuing and dealing with these really very well presented, I thought, kind of intensifying Arctic security dilemmas and problems. Thank you.
Could you perhaps also just briefly say something about the key shifts in the Arctic region more generally? since the war against Ukraine that are reshaping the landscape against which Russia seeks to realize its Arctic aims.
Absolutely. I think definitely what we've seen is also, for example, in Norway's High North strategy, is absolutely security in the driver's seat. As I've said before, looking back, I don't think thinking of that the Arctic was completely exceptional or removed from security challenges or is completely saturated with them today is terribly useful. I think that we need to look at how to respond to security challenges, and I think also identifying which areas of cooperation are absolutely essential and how to pursue those, or coordination are essential and how to pursue those in a way that both addresses the problem and supports broader security aims. So I think definitely the shift, regardless of whether you call it exceptional or non-exceptional, absolutely a shift towards putting security issues first. I think both, of course, in Russia, of course, but also in the other Arctic states. I think more generally, in the Arctic environment, it is getting used to this. I think particularly, and we'll talk about some of the narratives in kind of northern Norway and other places, that it was a very kind of full-fat version of cooperation. It wasn't just about dealing with, border crossing issues. It was about building community and friendship. And you know this very well from kind of studying the Barents cooperation. And I think that makes it, and I think it continued kind of in a period long after, it wasn't very tenable. It didn't make a lot of political sense. So I think that in the broader Arctic landscape, certainly what we see other Arctic states doing, not to speak of Russia, is I think we need to continue looking for sort of partial Arctic agreements, areas that may not including Russia, about how to govern emerging Arctic security, environmental, and other challenges that can then be scaled up later using what's available. Even though, as we know, international law is under press, I think we're still better served by working with what is available and identifying what needs to be developed. And finally, of course, and this is going to be, well, not finally, I have 2 more points, 3, 4, and 5, that, of course, the U.S. as an unreliable, unpredictable actor in Arctic politics, I think we'll all come back to that. There's yet another kind of shift from, with a changing Arctic cooperative setting. I think that the coordination amongst the 7 Arctic states in responding to Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine was extremely important in maintaining a sense of order around the region. And then what you have today is a situation where the United States, one of the most, a world great power, a very important Arctic actor, having the leader of that country threaten military force against both a NATO ally and another Arctic country, certainly really disrupts also this sort of narrative of Arctic unity that I think was performing an important security function, not least to think of also the ongoing threatening behavior and statements towards Canada, another Arctic state and neighbor. So I think from a kind of thinking of a Russian diplomacy perspective, I think this opens a lot of opportunities and certainly weakens the strategic unity of the other Arctic states. And then finally, just complex threats, as you were mentioning in your open remarks. I think the Shadow Fleet is a really good example of that. Basically, these uninsured or poorly insured, ready for the scrap heap tankers that are moving in and out of Arctic spaces as Russian companies and actors seek to evade the sanctions regime, posing in the sense of complex risks and threats, posing both an environmental threat, doing things like illegal ship-to-ship transfer at sea to avoid coming to port, as well as presenting a security risk, as you were talking about also subsea infrastructure. And we know in the Arctic that we're reliant on subsea infrastructure for really important aspects of connectivity. Yet, given the great distances, costs, and smaller kind of users on both sides, a lot of Arctic subsea infrastructure lacks the redundancy that either kind of having backups that gives resilience in the face of hybrid threats like this that I know others will talk about. So in sum, we're simply looking at Russia's diplomacy as well as all other Arctic states' diplomacy is playing out against a backdrop of many moving parts in a kind of an Arctic order that's under very significant pressure and change.
Thank you. I turn to Mark, to your right. Mark, a direct consequence of the war appears to be the acceleration of Russia's pivot towards the east. most notably perhaps China, in its search for new partnerships and alliances to support its Arctic ambitions that we have been discussing already. Could you tell us a little bit more about this evolving Russo-Chinese partnership and its impact in the Arctic, and also the implications of this partnership for the broader geopolitical dynamics in the Arctic?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's been really fascinating trying to track the progress of not only China's Arctic policy, but also the questions which are surrounding how China and Russia have been cooperating in the region. So when China originally began to put together its Polar Silk Road concept, so we go back to about 2017, it was understood that Russia would be a major part of that process. And in terms of Russia's sort of pivot to the east, that had been very much planned well before Arctic policy between the two powers had really come together. It was understood by the Putin regime that East Asia as a whole, especially China, would be a very important economic partner, especially as relations with the West began to deteriorate. The problem, though, is we saw very early, after 2017, when the Polar Silk Road was announced, that the interests of both Russia and China really had begun to diverge quite early. Now, when Russian policymakers were asked, okay, what is the nature of your cooperation with Beijing, you would get variations of the term, well, we're very happy to get Chinese support. We are very happy that China is interested in investing, for example, in Siberian oil and gas, which has been going on for quite some time. But there was always the added caveat that we are the Arctic state. Russia is the Arctic state. And that needed to be understood from the beginning. China is still a relative newcomer to the Arctic, even in comparison with other non-Arctic countries in Europe and in Asia. And China is still very much on a learning curve. And when the Polar Silk Road was first announced, and when there was all kinds of discussion about Russia and China cooperation, Beijing really pictured a relatively straight line upwards in terms of its Arctic presence. That has not come to pass. In reality, it's more like a pretzel. It's really important to look at the amount of internal and external shocks which the Sino-Russian partnership experienced, not the least of which being the aftershocks of the full invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So what this meant was that, first of all, China's ambitions to make use of the Northern Sea route for shipping had to be curbed very quickly. You had large Chinese companies such as COSCO tap dancing around the idea that, okay, the conditions are simply not right for large-scale shipping. You had sort of pulling back, if you will, of China realizing that its relationship with Russia, its neutrality policy towards Russia, was causing harm to other areas of Arctic diplomacy, not the least of which being in North America and, quite frankly, in Europe. So what we're seeing now in regards to China-Russia partnership, there's been no shortage of very high-level meetings between leaders, having cocktail parties saying that we are going to deepen our Arctic partnership, especially in the scientific and economic areas. But in terms of the actual depth, we have not seen a great deal of progress being made. A lot of infrastructure projects, which were announced a decade ago, are still on the paper napkin stage. The whole issue of projects like Power of Siberia 2 have been halting at best. And it is probably not an accident that China has begun to redouble its efforts to expand outward to other parts of the Arctic, to say, look, we want to be a partner, we want to be a stakeholder in the region. Nor is it an accident that Russia is starting to put out feelers to other non-Arctic states, such as India, such as the Gulf region, to say, okay, let's start developing partnerships. It really goes down to the issue of trust. It really goes down to the issue of how well does China and Russia trust each other in the Arctic, considering that they both are approaching the region from vastly different viewpoints. Now, what has happened really recently is China has attempted to jumpstart, if you will, the Polar Silk Road. Keeping in mind the changed geopolitical situation, I'm very sure that U.S. policy towards the Arctic is prompting some of this. So a few months back, we saw a great deal of ink being spilled in the Chinese press about a ship called the Istanbul Bridge. This was the first container ship of its type to make the run through the Northern Sea route in quite some time. And it made a celebrated journey to Northern Europe, eventually to Britain. And this was really seen as the vanguard of the revival of the Polar Silk Road. We're also in a little bit of a watch and wait mode for those who are looking at China's Arctic policy. So we have the next 5-year plan coming out, and it's going to be published either next month or shortly thereafter. And there's already been a lot of discussion about where the polar regions are going to factor into that. China has considered the Arctic to be a strategic new frontier for quite some time now, and it is understood that there is a great deal of synergy, at least in terms of strategy, between China and Russia. And this has led to a great deal of puffing up of the fact that China and Russia are going to form some kind of Northern Alliance or some kind of military pact. This has been talked about for the better part of 20 years. And we're simply not seeing that appearing. And a lot of that goes back to the idea of trust. Now, you can say, okay, what about the recent maneuvers, the Chinese and Russian Coast Guard? What about the maneuvers off of Alaska? Yes, those are significant. Those are very important. These are loud signals to the West that, look, we are here too, that we are not going to cede the Arctic to the West. But a lot of these still very much have symbolic value, and you don't see a great deal of foreign presence in key Russian strategic areas, such as, let's say, off Murmansk. And that is because Moscow has made it very clear that there are very specific barriers, red lines, to the degree of which we are going to let outside actors get involved in our Arctic policy, especially as Russia is starting to kind of rethink its own Arctic approach. So it's very important to keep in mind that a lot of the nature of the partnership still tends to be very much focused on symbolism, very much focused on sending costly signals. But looking at where the trajectories of these two countries are going in the Arctic, and I'll complete this here, I think it's also important to look at a what-if question if we're going to be extrapolating about what's happening in the future. What is going to happen if China and Russia begin to diverge more directly in their Arctic policies? What happens when China says, well, we can operate in the Central Arctic now. We are no longer as dependent on Russia as we used to be. And I think that is a scenario that needs to be worked out as well. Certainly we need to talk about cooperation, but we also need to talk about the divisions, the differences in policy between the two powers.
Thank you. Thomas, as one of your fields of knowledge is security, I'll start to ask you about the military situation in the north. How has Russia's military posture in the Barents Sea and the Arctic evolved since 22? And I'm especially thinking of the Kola Peninsula, which you know very well, right across the border, which is a huge stronghold for the Russian military. Which changes do you see there, if any?
We see big changes. Thank you for the question, bringing it up. Let's focus on two different parts of the military. One is the army, where Russia after 2022 have been restructuring its entire Leningrad military district. That includes all army units from the Baltics and all up to the Kola Peninsula. So seen from the border and into the nearest 20-30 kilometers from the border with Norway, there are very few soldiers left. Most of them have been sent to the battlefields in eastern Ukraine, where most of those are either killed or severely wounded. We are talking thousands of soldiers from the 200 Motorized Rifle Brigade in Piechenga and the 61st Naval Brigade in Sputnik, all in a stone throw's distance from Norway, that are killed over the last 4 years. But on paper, Vladimir Putin signed the order when restructuring the Leningrad military district to go from brigade level to division level. And a division is 2 or 3 times as many soldiers as a brigade. So what we until recently called the 200 Motorized Brigade in Piechenga is now the 71st Division. Motorized division in the area. But that doesn't mean that there are many more soldiers. Russia is probably losing more soldiers in Ukraine than they are able to recruit. And the main areas where they are recruiting soldiers now is in prison and among reservists in the age of 45 to 55 years old. The scenarios on the soldiers, it's doesn't frighten us from the Norwegian side. But at the same time, we have learned that Russia is a country that is unpredictable, and they do things that are very untraditional in traditional military thinking. So be prepared, people. Be prepared for surprises. And one of those surprises is, for instance, the day when there are, let's say, 100, 150 North Korean soldiers coming to train in the Pechenga district. Wow, that's going to make headlines in Norwegian and European media. And this is all about the Russian military in the northern regions. It's about creating surprises and fear. The other part on the Kola Peninsula, as everyone knows, is of course the navy. The biggest navy of Russia is the Northern Fleet, sailing out of Severomorsk and those areas. We have seen a big change there in the way the training has been conducted in the period 2015 up till February 2022. The Russian Northern Fleet had a lot of live shootings along the coast of Norway in the Norwegian Economical Zone, from the North Sea in the south and up to the waters between Svalbard and Franz Josef Land in the north. After 24th of February 2022, there hasn't been one single live shooting exercise by Russian naval vessels anywhere west of North Cape. So everything now is concentrated in the Barents Sea, and the Russian Navy today consider the entire Barents Sea as their area of operation, and they are planning to expand the protection of the ballistic missile submarines. That means that, for instance, the waters between Svalbard and Franz Josef Land are way more frequently used today, and that includes the most modern hypersonic missiles like the Zircon and other frightening cruise missiles that Russia can equip with nuclear weapons, and that have a range that actually means that multi-purpose submarines can launch from the Barents Sea and hit most of the Nordic countries' military bases, from the airport in Rovaniemi and Kallax in Luleå, Öland, Norway, Bodø, Andøya, Bardufoss, etc. So they don't actually have to do what we saw in the Cold War area, to sail out in the North Atlantic to make disruptions for the Nordic defenses. What I'm very worried about is what's happening 48 hours from now, when the last remaining arms reduction and arms control agreement is expiring. Then we are, ladies and gentlemen, back to a situation we haven't been in on planet Earth since 1969. So I'm talking about the New START agreement, and not necessarily because I'm afraid that Russia will increase the number of nuclear weapons on their ballistic missile submarines sailing out to the Barents Sea, but because that agreement is also the one that was the last facilitating of joint inspections between the United States Navy and the Russian Navy. So it means that we will lose the last open door into actually having a conversation, having a military-to-military, uniform-to-uniform counting of weapons and understanding of how they are thinking. And that, combined with Russia's using of the Arctic areas for the testing of new weapon systems, is what we all should be worried about. You know, you cannot test long-range weapons in the Baltics. There are too many people, too many countries. You cannot do it in the Black Sea area. Russia don't have a navy there anymore, or hardly have a navy there. And Japan is too close for the Pacific. So it's the Arctic, the White Sea, the Barents Sea, and the Kara Sea, where Russia today is testing their nuclear-powered cruise missiles, nuclear-powered underwater drones, and all these mad scientist weapons that you have only read about in comics before. So that is the short answer to your question. Thank you.
Just another short question also before we return to Kari. It's more a question to you as a journalist and editor. Given all the censorship, information control, how do you in the media currently get trustworthy information? And how are you able to transmit it to the public? Could you say a little bit about that? Because this is also sensitive issues, right? It's not easy to get. It's difficult for scholars, and I guess it's difficult for journalists too to get good information.
It is our biggest headache every morning is how to cross-check information and at all getting information. For those of you who are following the Barents Observer, for those of you who are not, you should do. But for those of you who have been following the Barents Observer, you know that we haven't reported about one single incident on a Russian nuclear-powered submarine since 2019. That doesn't mean that it hasn't been any incidents on the Russian submarines, either with the weapon systems or with the reactors or with the crew on board. It just means that we don't have access to it anymore. And to get trustworthy information is very, very difficult. People giving interview to the Barents Observer, they risk 6 years in jail. We cannot travel there. I'm persona non grata, and all my fellow journalists, including the exiled Russian journalist working in our newsroom, cannot go there. But there are still some few openings. The internet is luckily still working. There is 1 million Russians that left the country after 2022, all living all over Europe and North America. Every single one of them have friends, colleagues, neighbors, etc., family living at home. They get a lot of information out. There are quite a few military or former military people that have left the country that we can talk with. And I have to admit also, we are back to what we did in the 1980s. Not what I did, and I was small then, but what people did in the 1980s, studying military issues in the Soviet Union. We're looking at satellite images. So February is always a highly interesting period for us, because then the sun is coming over the horizon in the Arctic. So now we can see daylight satellite images every day. Then we're sitting there counting how many submarines are at port, and if someone is not at port, that was at port last week, we try to figure out who it is, etc., etc. So all kind of open source information. That's the way we do it. I could give a private lecture and for everyone. I could give a lecture on how we are reaching the audience in Russia. We are blocked on internet, but that is a longer story. But we managed to do. We have thousands of readers in Russia still, and if Vladimir Putin one day decide to switch from the internet to the so-called RUNET, meaning cutting Russia off the global internet, we are ready with FM and other radio transmitter, and we'll start radio programs as Radio Free Europe did in the 1970s and 1980s. It's impossible to stop free journalism.
Thank you. Let's speak a little bit more about the Norwegian Arctic. In recent months, weeks, days, there's been a lot of focus on Greenland, but there has also been quite a lot of focus on Svalbard, which is the Norwegian Arctic archipelago. This is, of course, first due to all this talk about Greenland. There's a spillover. But it's also due to Russia's strong presence and interest there, which Urmas Bayat mentioned in his introduction. Kari, you have recently, together with Thomas, by the way, published a report on Russian hybrid activities on Svalbard. And you know quite a lot about the developments there. You've been studying it for years. How would you say Russia's presence on Svalbard has evolved since 22, or even since 2014, since the annexation of Crimea? Following up upon that, why would you say Svalbard is important to Russia? Please, if you may try to answer these questions.
Thank you, Bjarge. Is this on?
Yes.
It's on.
Yes.
Thank you, Bjarge. I'll be brief. I'll try to be brief because we want discussion with the audience as well. But I'll just start with a small tribute to the Barents Observer, who I believe is doing an incredibly important job of fact-checking and contradicting Russian information operations, because this is Russia's main hybrid tool towards Western Arctic states. It's all kinds of disinformation, all kinds of conspiracy theories, all kinds of Kremlin foreign policy narratives that are targeting us, but first and foremost, they're targeting the Russian population. I mean, Russia needs to control its population. It's waging a very bad war, and a war which would be highly unpopular and create a lot of unrest in Russia if it wasn't for the fact that Russia has developed in very authoritarian ways over the last decade, and increasingly so since 2022. And this is a point, I think, which has not been really lifted in the panel so far, except from Urmas, who touched upon it. What we are facing in the Arctic is authoritarian Russia, also on Svalbard and in the Nordic border region towards Russia. And this is why Russia is conducting disinformation campaigns, doing its information operations, and also increasingly using this toolkit of hybrid threats against its Nordic neighbors and what it terms as unfriendly states since 2022. So this is what we are witnessing on Svalbard, and very much so also in line with what Urmas emphasized since over the long last decade. I mean, this is not new, but it has intensified on Svalbard very much so since 2022. So we see various kinds of Russian rallying around the flag, promoting its symbols of victory in Ukraine on Svalbard, on Norwegian soil. And this is what Russia is doing at home. This is what Russia is doing every Victory Day, every May 9 on the Red Square, flashing its weapons and flashing all its symbols that it will eventually win in Ukraine. And of course, the warfare in Ukraine has been the dominant political issue in the Russian public sphere since 2013-14. We just haven't seen it because most of us do not follow the Russian public sphere from day to day. But this is very true, and this is why Russia is also acting more assertively, more patriotic, more nationalistic on Svalbard, organizing Victory Day parades, Immortal Regiment parades, if you've seen those parades where and they are co-opted, of course. They are created, orchestrated by Moscow, where seemingly ordinary Russians parade with images of their deceased grandfathers or uncles who gave their lives during the Great Patriotic War, World War II. And the argument from the Kremlin is that these parades are now more important than ever because they show that Russia fought down Nazism in 1944-45. Russian soldiers in Ukraine today are doing the same. They're fighting the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev. So this is the main Kremlin narrative around what it's doing in Ukraine, and it has very specific impacts also on Svalbard. And what Russia is doing on Svalbard has a lot to do with convincing its own home audience in Russia that Russia is present in the Arctic. Russia is strong and has a strong patriotic community in the Arctic, even in this faraway Arctic archipelago of Svalbard on Norwegian territory. This is half the reason why Russia is increasingly, or the Russian state actors on Svalbard are increasingly promoting Kremlin foreign policy narratives on Svalbard. The other side of this is, of course, that they are testing their room for maneuvering vis-a-vis Norway and NATO. They are testing where Norway's limits are. How does Norway read an Immortal Regiment parade in Barentsburg? How does Norway react? Can Russia go further? What can they do next? Also, they're challenging very directly, and has been doing so since 2014, the Western sanction regime on Svalbard, by staging various provocation and information operations, like when former Vice Minister Dmitry Rogozin all of a sudden arrived in Svalbard in 2015 in the airport for a very brief stopover before he continued to a Russian military base in the Arctic, or a scientific base. And Rogozin's visit is really a very good example of Russian hybrid threats on Svalbard, because it was staged very surprisingly. Ragozin was on this EU sanction list, so Norwegian authorities were forced to react, questioning, summoning the Russian ambassador and questioning, what was this sanctioned Russian citizen doing in Longyearbyen all of a sudden. And Russia answered back by saying that, Western sanctions do not apply on Svalbard. It's not part of the Schengen area. And in legal terms, they are using this gray zone, this unclear field to challenge the sanctions. This is one example. They have been doing it repeatedly, challenging the Western sanctions by way of these surprise visits or surprise orchestrated events on Svalbard. And of course, challenging the Western sanctions is key to Russia because this is what keeps them from winning the warfare in Ukraine. So, and also what we see, which is I think some of the most worrying things Russia is doing on Svalbard, is what we call building coercive potential. So they are investing in symbols, items on Svalbard that can be used if Moscow sees fit in a more intense security situation. 2 years ago, or 2.5 years now, a giant Russian Orthodox cross was erected in Pyramiden, which is an abandoned Russian settlement on Svalbard. Norwegian pushback was not firm enough because Norway is cautious not to provoke Russia in Arctic affairs. Of course, we're a neighboring country. We have to be cautious. The result is, since pushback was not really strong, the result is that Russia 1 year later also established a Russian Orthodox congregation, and we now have a permanently stationed Russian Orthodox priest in Barentsburg for the first time in history. So this is a very good example of testing the borders, pushing and going further if there is not enough pushback and direct communication from Norway that we do not accept this. And of course, it's really hard for Norway to counter these hybrid tactics from Russia because we are a country who cherish our liberal freedoms very much. We have freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Of course, Russian Orthodox activity is allowed in the Norwegian sphere. But we should also be aware that the Russian Orthodox Church is one of Putin's closest ideological allies. They operate on behalf of the Russian state in its foreign policy, and they also are known to cooperate closely with Russian intelligence services abroad. They have a very important role in Russia's foreign policy, also when it comes to more covert issues. And I think the fact that we now have another Russian Orthodox congregation on Norwegian soil directly under the Moscow Patriarch is not good news for Norway, but it's very difficult, of course, to counter and handle this in good ways. So this coercive potential is really I think one of the most serious things that Russia is doing now. They have been doing this in the border region with Norway, in mainland Norway for years, establishing various symbols and monuments that have been invested in. And we see now that they are investing also in this Orthodox cross. A Russian Orthodox bishop is repeatedly returning to the cross, using it for more and more dates in the Russian military calendar. So last year, he used it also to commemorate June 22nd, which is the day when Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union, a very important day in the Kremlin's myth about the Great Patriotic War and how they fought down Nazism and how they are today fighting neo-Nazism.
Thank you. We still have 25 minutes left, and I think we'll spend them, we'll let the audience ask some questions. I'll just have to say to the speakers that there is water here in case you would like to help yourself. No tables, but at least water. So I think let's have perhaps 3 questions at a time. to the entire panel, including Urmas. Anyone? 1, 2. Please. Please.
Rasmus, I'm Arctic editor of Altinget, a Danish online news site. My question is that NATO is now slowly moving more into the Arctic and also in a more formal fashion, and I'm wondering which, for the Arctic writ large, or if this corner of the Arctic, if you prefer, what capabilities do you see as the most immediately necessary to invest in? Thank you.
Hi, Megan Richmond from the UK's Foreign Office. I'm just interested, Eleanor, about what sort of cooperation you see with Russia in terms of your low-fat vision.
And there was the third one. Anyone? Yep.
Thank you. Tom Mulesman for Time Magazine. Before this session, I briefly chatted with an expert in the room who noted that the Arctic is the most dangerous region on Earth because of the concentration of nuclear weapons. And Thomas, you spoke about testing of mad scientist weapons that we used to read about only in comic books. In the background, of course, is the risk of a major conflict beginning for the first time in the Arctic, not just spilling into the Arctic, but starting there. So with that in mind, just how high are the risks right now of conflicts, and how might it begin?
No conflict will start in the Arctic because of the Arctic itself. There is no reason. There are no disputed areas. Okay, we can argue about Greenland or not, but at least in this part of the Arctic. What is dangerous in the Arctic is that it's a very harsh climate to operate in. Polar night storms, cold, etc. And my biggest fear is actually that there is an accident that is triggering a misunderstanding, and that there are no or very few open lines between military commanders. We have one between Norway and the Northern Fleet, but that's one of very, very few. So a kind of escalating situation because of an misunderstanding, because of some kind of accidents. We remember very well August 12, 2000, when the Kursk submarine, the torpedo compartment, exploded, killing all 118 on board. What was the first narrative coming out of the Kremlin? It collided with a US submarine, which of course was bullshit. But today, 26 years later, such a scenario will not meet resistance inside Russia. And then someone might trigger the escalation button, and that's mainly the thing. Unless Putin gets desperate because he's losing the war in Ukraine, and do the same as his colleague in Berlin did 82 years ago, opening another front to escalate the military situation. And then if Putin is looking along the border, where is his heart? Putin has a special place in his heart for Arctic and the Navy and Arctic military. So, but that's a kind of worst case unpredictable scenario. To your question about NATO in the Arctic and so on, I will actually take it mention a few other things that we very often forget, and that is all the attempts NATO is doing to de-escalate in the Arctic. I mean, before 2022, both the UK and the US Navy were planning a freedom of navigation voyage with a military surface vessel along Russia's Northern Sea route. That is today totally out of the table, both in London and in Pentagon. And when the Ford Carrier Group last year sailed north to a kind of deterrent Russia. They were outside of Tromsø, and two of the destroyers sailed a few nautical miles east of the North Cape. But not one single NATO surface warship have ever sailed east of the Varanger Fjord, meaning they have not been into Russian economical zone in the Barents Sea after 2022, as they did several times before, including Norway. That would never have done such kind of thing a long time before. I'm then, of course, talking only about the surface vessel. What happens underwater, I don't know. But I guess there are both French, British, Norwegian, and US submarines sailing eastern Barents Sea. But all this is to de-escalate. And we see it now in March when next NATO exercise is taking place inside the Arctic Circle. The main part of that exercise is not close to the Kola Peninsula, as it would have been if it was in the Baltic and the Baltic states, etc. Norway and NATO agree that we don't provoke by bringing more soldiers of non-military uniforms, non-Norwegian military uniforms east of the Porsanger area. So all those kind of issues. The rest is a kind of quite normal military activities following Russia's escalation in the Arctic that started back in 2007, when Russia first flew long-range strategic bombers outside the coast of Norway. Not least to talk about what Vladimir Putin did when he, for the third time, came to office in May 2012. When the first thing he did after he changed office with Medvedev was going back and signing 3 decrees, all of them on building new submarines, new surface vessels, all of it for the Northern Fleet. So it's not. We shouldn't look at this as a kind of equal escalation in the Arctic. I think the Putin is the main responsible here, and his actions in the north now is a direct follow-up of the war in Ukraine, which, from a Moscow point of view, is part of a bigger conflict with the collective West.
Thank you. Elana, then Kari, then Mark, please.
Great. Thank you for the questions. Megan, or to your question about kind of what do I mean when I talk about coordination, I think kind of the what I was jokingly calling kind of the low-fat version of Arctic cooperation, I don't think needs to be with Russia. I think that's the whole point. I think we can be thinking about different regional seas, different constellations of actors, and looking to see at what can be done to promote kind of secure, safe, stable Arctic at various sub-regional levels. And then eventually, in a very different time, I think it's possible to consider scaling it back up again. But I certainly frequently also think of, the kind of the children's rhyme about Humpty Dumpty or Lille Trille in Norwegian. That when something falls off the shelf, it's not going to be put back together in the same way once again. And so when I think about that sub-regional, I think it's based in, we've done a lot of research also comparing the Arctic to other major global ecosystems. And what we see is that about 40% of the world's ecosystems do have something that may not be exactly like kind of Arctic cooperation, but it's about kind of multi-issue cooperation amongst the bordering states. And we also know that about 60% of all international agreements are not fully international. They tend to be regional or bilateral. So thinking about the Arctic in that sense is about looking for opportunities to enhance governance and promote security and reduce the risk of what Thomas was pointing to, of accidents and miscalculations and incidents that could potentially escalate. I think with Russia, what we already have today is that within the Emergency Preparedness and Response Group within the Arctic Council still does some tabletop exercises. Norway, for example, has an agreement on incidents at sea that's still active. In the Bering, you have some cooperation still around the shipping lanes. It's an important way of reducing conflict. And in the Barents, you have Norway's agreement with Russia on negotiating Barents Sea fishing quotas, which were just recently concluded. Increasingly difficult to pull off, but is both of economic interest and also a very core species in the entire Barents Sea ecosystem. So when I'm thinking about, I think there certainly is a need to think about how to work for states and other actors to work more closely with with those countries that they do share values with. And that might be kind of more European, I think, as Urmas was saying in his opening remarks, for countries like the Nordics, enhancing Nordic cooperation, also with Canada and Europe. And you see that also in Norway's High North strategy. Certainly I was surprised even then to see that the US is still very much emphasized as a partner, but also very much Europe. It was published before the threats made against Greenland, but also looking to Europe in particular in the Nordic area as a chance to enhance relations. Yes, so I think we're entering a phase of where in addressing Arctic security and stability, we have to think can't be kind of stuck with like our full version of Arctic circumpolar cooperation. Basically, I think it's getting in the way of addressing important other issues that could be dealt with at a regional level. And I believe that we will see more sub-regional work, more involvement of the private sector, using companies also as in their capacity, particularly in ocean governance. So I think it's going to be kind of a more sub-regional, kind of all hands on deck sort of approach to that cooperation or coordination.
Yeah, just a very brief note on the risk for a direct military confrontation between Russia and NATO or parts of NATO in the Arctic. I think we should keep in mind that the warfare, Moscow is investing as much as it can in winning the war in Ukraine. So the picture is still the same as we concluded in 2022-23. You know, Russia does not have big capacities for warfare in the Arctic, and Russia does not want a direct military confrontation with NATO in the Arctic. So what we are seeing is Russia using low-cost but rather efficient hybrid threats and tools. I mean, this is why they are muscle flexing and showing off symbols of winning the war in Ukraine in the Arctic, showing off the Russian flag, the Soviet flag. It's low cost and it's scary. So Russia is posing as strong. And this is a key element to Russia's big information or disinformation operation about the Arctic, that Russia is actually strong, flexing its muscles, when the reality is that Russia does not have a lot of military capacity that it wants to use in the Arctic, except, of course, for the nuclear weapons, which we must hope also that the Kremlin still see that they have no interest in using. But at the same time, of course, there is also the fact that the warfare in Ukraine is making Russia more unstable in every meaning of the word, politically, militarily, economically, socially. And of course, it's really hard to predict. The attack on Ukraine was very much not in Russia's interest, and still it came. So predicting the future is really hard when it comes to Russia, and we need to follow Russian domestic developments very closely. We need to preserve our research on Russia and our good fact-checking journalism on Russia, because Russia is not necessarily an easy Arctic actor to read. Hasn't been for years, and ever much so. So yes.
Mark and then Urmas, please.
Just 2 quick points. I'm happy the issue of nuclear security came up. I would like to point out that one constant, and this tends to get lost in the discussion about Sino-Russian cooperation in the Arctic, is that China has repeatedly, ever since 2022, and we saw this in its 12-point plan that came out in 23, that China has been very much against the idea of nuclear proliferation and nuclear threats, including in the Arctic. And there, China has distanced itself from Russia quite significantly. Now, I can segue into, whether this is compatible with China's own nuclear weapons policy, but I would like to point out that this is one area where the two actors have diverged considerably. Second point about NATO, just one point. I could bring up a laundry list, but one point that kind of jumps out, and this is very important to a lot of work that's being done in Greenland. When we talk about NATO's role in the Arctic, we are dealing with a very specific geography, big surprise, but we are also dealing with a geography that is constantly changing in regards to the fact that climate change is still very much occurring. And this is important in regards to access. This is important to points that have been made about gray zone operations, about below threshold operations. The fact that we are dealing with loss of ice, we are dealing with a region where different types of access is now becoming much more important. So one area that I think is very important for NATO, in addition to the other points raised, is the fact that if we're talking about monitoring, if we're talking about eyes and ears, there needs to be a certain amount of flexibility to the fact that we are dealing with different spaces that are appearing at, in many cases, very rapid pace in terms of who can get where. Thanks.
Please.
Well, I guess at the moment, the highest risk for whatever more direct conflict in the Arctic is related to Spitsbergen, because what Russia also always wants and likes to do is mirroring, so that if they see that, well, Americans are on Greenland, then they like to mirror, to show that they also have now more free hands and capabilities. So that I guess all what we heard about recent developments in Spitsbergen, you should not underestimate, especially when the Orthodox Church is there, so that it's completely true that during Putin, Orthodox Church is very strong ideological weapon. Also, we see it during the war in Ukraine. We see their activities in many European countries, so that don't underestimate. Second is the element of hybrid war so far, which is attacks against infrastructure. So that it also, of course, has rather high potential of direct conflict, because if on the one hand there is willingness to, well, break or attack some parts of infrastructure, and finally, on the other hand, on the other side will be readiness to protect the infrastructure, so that it also, of course, may lead to the direct conflict on the spot, so that we have seen something already developing in this regard in some other parts of Europe, so that this, of course, is a very risky element. Then as background, we also should think on this, that it may happen that, for instance, if the massive war in Ukraine will end, it gives for Russia much more free hands to relocate their troops, to build up once again their military capabilities and also presence here in Arctic. So that it sounds very cynical, but unfortunately at the moment Ukrainians, with the price of their life, are winning time for us in the other parts of Europe. It's also obvious. Although, if to look at the patterns how Putin acted so far, and also in Ukraine, it's clear that he wants to win. So that in Ukraine, if in final end he gets, some parts of Ukrainian territories, plus, Ukraine will not join, for instance, in foreseeable future with NATO or the EU, then of course Putin can show it to Russian audience that he is in the same line with Stalin, Peter the Great, and others who made Russia bigger, also physically bigger. And here, of course, it comes also about the calculation. Does he or his regime think that they can win NATO? Because for sure he does not want to go into history as loser. So that in this sense, with Ukraine, unfortunately, he is on the track to make Russia bigger physically. But it's not that sure, I guess, with any other part of Europe. And that's why all this, what NATO and EU and we all are doing here, to send clear signals and messages to Russia that West is not weak anymore, is absolutely important. So that Putin and his regime has to believe that he cannot win in other parts. So that's why I guess that he permanently is testing. You mentioned examples here in Norway, but it happens all the time everywhere. In my country, in Estonia, a few months ago, they sent 3 military aircrafts for 12 minutes into our airspace. That just to check what NATO does, how quickly, the planes of NATO are responding, what they do. So that, and they, check these limits all the time. So that's why I guess this is actually dangerous, that if some country says that, we don't want to provoke Russians. Sorry, but Russians don't need to be provoked if they want to do something. Ukrainians also didn't provoke them. Many others didn't provoke them. So that in this sense, I guess this is rather not adequate at this stage to say that, if they make another step on our expense, we don't do anything because we don't want, to irrigate or to provoke them. I guess this is counterproductive, Because at the moment, it's absolutely important that they realize in Kremlin that West is not weak anymore. Because if they see this weakness, and if Ukrainian war is over, well, then they will have resources. And it's, in this, in our case, to avoid that also the political thinking will support this in Moscow.
Thank you. Elana, final comment?
Very short, as you covered the point I wanted to bring up, that often when we're gathered in Arctic settings, sort of the rest of the world falls away a little bit, and we think about what needs to be financed in the Arctic and so on. But really, just to underline the point that probably the most important step for Arctic security is also Ukraine, supporting Ukraine in winning the war against Russia, or securing a situation in which Russia doesn't come out of the war they started having won. And I think that's the point that brings with it a lot of threats and renewed also political strategies against the Arctic that would be very detrimental.
Thank you. And with that, I think we have to conclude this session. Thanks to the panel and the audience as well. Thank you for joining our session this morning.